They laughed at him at first, not openly, not cruelly, but with the quiet disbelief reserved for people who speak too early about things the world is not ready to hear. He was not shouting on street corners or predicting the end of days. He sat calmly in small rooms, spoke in measured tones, and warned that a quiet fracture was forming beneath the surface of global power. He said it would not begin with missiles or marching armies. It would begin with pressure, economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, and a confrontation in a place most people were not watching. Years before headlines would scream about sudden escalations, frozen alliances, and unexpected clashes in the Western Hemisphere, this modern seer described a moment he called the pivot day. A day when attention would snap southward, a day when rhetoric would harden, a day when the world would realize that old rivalries were being rehearsed in new theaters. He never called himself a prophet. He avoided that word. He preferred observer. But those who listened closely noticed something unsettling. His warnings were not poetic. They were procedural, step by step. Action followed by reaction. Silence followed by shock. He spoke about a powerful northern leader who thrived on confrontation, a man who believed pressure was the purest form of negotiation. He spoke about a southern nation rich in resources but trapped in political isolation, ruled by a figure who mistook endurance for invincibility. And he spoke about a neighboring country that would be forced into the role of unwilling intermediary, pulled into a storm it did not create but could not escape. At the time, these statements felt abstract. Analysts dismissed them as vague. Commentators said similar things had been said for decades, but the seer insisted the timing was different. He said the calendar mattered. He said the world would ignore the warning because nothing dramatic would happen at first. No invasion, no declaration, just statements, sanctions, movements behind closed doors. He described the way language would change before events did, how words like concern would quietly turn into response, how monitoring the situation would become considering options. He said once those phrases appeared together, the outcome would already be decided. The most unsettling part was not what he predicted, but how casually he spoke about it. There was no urgency in his voice, no attempt to persuade, only a calm certainty that history moved according to patterns, and that this pattern had already begun. In private sessions, he was more specific. He spoke about a single date in late winter, a date he said would not be remembered for what happened on that day, but for what began afterward. He said markets would react before people did. He said journalists would initially misread the signals. And he said political leaders would pretend surprise, even though the decisions had been drafted long before. At the time, few connected his words to reality. The world was distracted. Other conflicts dominated attention. Other crises felt louder, more immediate. The idea that tension in South America could become a strategic lever for global powers seemed exaggerated. But the seer insisted this was precisely why it would work. He explained that power rarely moves where people are watching. It moves where resistance is weakest and assumptions are strongest. He said decision-makers believed the region was predictable, containable. That belief, he warned, would become the opening. Midway through one recorded talk, he paused and said something that now feels chilling in retrospect. He said, "When the headlines finally catch up, people will ask why no one saw it coming. The truth is, many did. They just did not want to say it out loud." If you're finding this story intriguing so far, take a second right now. This video is not free to make, and the only price is simple. Hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps this channel grow. and I read every single one. Now, back to the story. What made his warning different was his understanding of personalities. He did not frame events as accidents of history. He framed them as collisions of character. He described the Northern leader as someone who viewed compromise as weakness, someone who believed unpredictability created leverage. He described the Southern president as someone who equated survival with victory, who mistook staying in power for winning the game. Between them, he said, was a chessboard disguised as diplomacy. He warned that public statements would be designed not for negotiation, but for domestic audiences, that threats would be delivered indirectly, through allies and economic channels, to maintain plausible deniability. He said the real conflict would not be announced. It would be implied. Most dismissed him because he did not offer a dramatic climax. There was no single explosive prophecy, no final vision of collapse. Instead, he described erosion, relationships wearing down, trust evaporating, lines being crossed so slowly that each one felt justifiable on its own. He also warned about something else, something even fewer people wanted to hear. He said the confrontation would be useful. Not tragic, not regrettable, but useful. Useful for distraction. Useful for leverage. Useful for reshaping narratives at home. That statement made audiences uncomfortable. People prefer to believe conflicts are failures. He suggested they were tools. When asked if the situation could be avoided, he answered carefully. He said it could be delayed, softened, redirected, but not stopped entirely. The incentives were already aligned. Too many interests benefited from tension. Too many careers were built on standing firm. By the time the world began to sense that something was shifting, his words had already been recorded, archived, forgotten. Clips circulated quietly among small communities. A few listeners returned to them months later, surprised by how closely reality seemed to echo his calm warnings. But this story does not end with a prediction. It begins there. Because once the pressure started to build, once statements hardened and positions locked in, the question was no longer whether he had been right. The question became something far more uncomfortable. What happens when a warning is accurate but ignored? And more importantly, who benefits from pretending it was unpredictable? In the next part, we'll follow how those early signals transformed into real consequences, how private strategies became public confrontations, and why that winter date he mentioned still haunts those who remember his words. At first, nothing appeared to change. Press briefings sounded routine. Diplomatic language remained carefully polished, layered with words designed to reassure rather than alarm. Officials spoke of cooperation, regional stability, and mutual respect. To the casual observer, the world looked calm. But beneath the surface, the pattern the seer had described was unfolding with quiet precision. The first shift came not through confrontation, but through absence. Meetings that once happened regularly were delayed, then postponed, then quietly removed from schedules altogether. Joint statements were replaced by unilateral remarks. Advisors stopped using the word partnership and began favoring national interest. These were subtle changes, easy to dismiss unless you were looking for them. The seer had warned that this phase would feel boring. He said people would underestimate it because nothing dramatic would happen on television. No emergency sessions, no raised voices, just silence where dialogue used to exist. At the same time, economic signals began to ripple outward. Markets reacted before politicians acknowledged anything was wrong. Small fluctuations appeared in energy forecasts. Shipping routes were discussed in new terms. Insurance premiums adjusted quietly, not because of events, but because of expectations. Behind closed doors, strategy papers were being revised. The Northern power began testing language, not directly toward its Southern counterpart, but toward surrounding nations. Statements emphasized sovereignty, border security, and responsibility. None of it sounded aggressive on its own, but together, they formed a narrative of justification, a framework in which future actions could be presented as inevitable rather than deliberate. The Southern leadership responded as the seer predicted they would, not with compromise, but with defiance. Public speeches leaned heavily on resilience. Endurance was framed as victory. Any external pressure was portrayed as proof of strength rather than vulnerability. Supporters were reminded that survival itself was success. This exchange of narratives created a feedback loop. Each side spoke past the other, not to persuade, but to reinforce internal legitimacy. The conflict, still unofficial, had become politically useful. Meanwhile, the neighboring nation found itself drawn into the situation in ways it had not anticipated. Geographic reality made neutrality impossible. Trade routes, migration patterns, and security concerns converged. The seer had said this country would be forced into a role it did not seek, becoming a pressure valve between larger forces. And that is exactly what happened. Suddenly, diplomatic visits increased. Delegations arrived with carefully worded proposals. Offers of cooperation came bundled with expectations. Refusing them carried consequences, accepting them carried risks. The nation's leadership attempted balance, but balance is fragile when competing interests pull in opposite directions. Publicly, officials insisted everything was under control. Privately, emergency plans were being updated. What made this phase particularly dangerous was its ambiguity. There was no single moment to point to and say, "This is where it began." Instead, there was accumulation. Small decisions stacked atop one another, each defensible on its own, collectively steering events toward confrontation. The seer had warned about this exact dynamic. He said modern conflicts rarely announce themselves. They emerge through normalization. What once would have been shocking becomes routine through repetition. Media coverage reflected this uncertainty. Some outlets treated developments as routine diplomacy. Others framed them as early warning signs. The lack of consensus dulled public reaction. People moved on quickly, distracted by louder stories elsewhere. But inside government offices, the tone was changing. Language and internal communications hardened. Risk assessments were rewritten. Scenarios that once seemed theoretical were now considered plausible. Military planners were not preparing for war, they insisted. They were ensuring readiness. The distinction mattered politically, but practically, the result was the same. The seer's words resurfaced quietly during this time. Old recordings circulated again, shared among analysts and independent commentators. Listeners noted how accurately he had described the sequence. Not specific events, but behavior. The psychology of escalation. One particular line stood out. He had said, "The most dangerous moment is when everyone believes they are reacting, not acting." As pressure increased, each side framed its moves as responses to provocation, even when those provocations were interpretive rather than factual. This is how conflicts gain momentum without intention. The Northern leader's strategy relied on controlled unpredictability. Just enough uncertainty to keep opponents off balance, not enough to trigger unified resistance. The Southern leadership relied on symbolism and endurance, believing time itself was an ally. Between them, space for de-escalation narrowed. International organizations attempted mediation, but their language lagged behind reality. By the time concerns were formally expressed, positions had already solidified. Offers of dialogue were met with suspicion. Every proposal was examined for hidden advantage. The neighboring country's population began to feel the effects first. Economic pressure translated into rising costs. Border regions experienced increased strain. Social tensions grew quietly, fueled by uncertainty rather than ideology. None of this made headlines at first, and that was the point. The seer had said the true impact would be felt before it was acknowledged, that people would live inside the consequences long before they understood the cause. As winter approached, statements became sharper, diplomatic pauses stretched longer. Observers began to use words like standoff and showdown, though no one could agree on when it had begun. The world was now close to the date the seer had warned about, a date he said would feel ordinary when it arrived, because the real change would not be the event itself. It would be the realization that there was no way back to how things had been before. In the next part, we'll examine that pivotal moment, the day that passed quietly on calendars but permanently altered the trajectory of the situation, and why its significance only became clear afterward. When the day finally arrived, it did not announce itself with sirens or emergency broadcasts. There were no breaking news banners, no dramatic images flooding the screens. Most people woke up, checked their phones, and went about their routines. That ordinariness was exactly what made it dangerous. The seer had said the date would pass quietly. He warned that people would expect spectacle, and therefore miss the significance of restraint. Power, he explained, no longer needed explosions to reshape the world. It only needed alignment. On that morning, official statements were released almost simultaneously across multiple capitals. Each one appeared measured, cautious, and reasonable. None mentioned conflict directly. Instead, they spoke of reassessment, strategic review, and long-term security priorities. The language was technical, even dull, but analysts noticed something unusual. The phrasing was too similar, not coordinated openly, but harmonized in tone, as if everyone had agreed, without saying so, that a line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. The Northern Power framed its announcement as defensive necessity. A recalibration, they said, based on evolving realities. The Southern leadership responded hours later, declaring sovereignty and warning against external interference. The neighboring nation issued a statement calling for calm while activating measures that suggested it expected the opposite. None of these actions were extreme on their own. Together they formed a lock. Behind the scenes, the shift was far more tangible. Financial institutions updated risk models. Logistics companies rerouted shipments preemptively. Diplomatic staff were quietly reassigned. Embassies reviewed evacuation protocols, not because they expected immediate danger, but because they no longer trusted predictability. This was the moment the seer had emphasized most strongly. He said the world would change, not when leaders spoke loudly, but when systems adjusted silently, when infrastructure adapted to a future that had not yet been officially acknowledged. For ordinary people, the first signs were subtle. Prices fluctuated in ways that felt disconnected from local realities. News reports used conditional language more frequently. Words like if, could, and may dominated headlines. Anxiety became ambient rather than acute. Social media amplified confusion. Some voices dismissed the situation as manufactured panic. Others claimed it was the beginning of something much larger. Without a clear event to react to, audiences fractured into interpretations. That fragmentation benefited those in power. Because uncertainty delays resistance. The seer had warned that modern influence thrives in ambiguity. When no one agrees on what is happening, no one agrees on how to respond. By the time clarity arrives, momentum is already established. Late that evening, a closed-door meeting took place that would later be referenced only indirectly. No transcript was released, no official summary was provided, but leaks suggested that options once considered unacceptable were now categorized as on the table. That phrase appeared repeatedly in subsequent weeks. On the southern side, internal divisions deepened. Hardliners argued that confrontation was inevitable and should be embraced on their terms. Moderates urged caution, warning that isolation would only accelerate decline. The leadership balanced these pressures carefully, projecting unity while managing fracture beneath the surface. The neighboring country faced its own reckoning. Publicly, neutrality remained the official stance. Privately, preparations continued. Security forces adjusted deployments, border infrastructure was reinforced, communication channels multiplied, some overt, others deliberately opaque. The seer had said this nation would become a mirror, reflecting the tension of larger powers while absorbing disproportionate consequences. Not because it chose to, but because geography and history allowed no alternative. International observers began using a new phrase, managed instability. It described a condition where disruption was not accidental, but regulated. Enough pressure to achieve leverage, not enough chaos to trigger collective intervention. This concept defined the period that followed. Weeks passed without dramatic escalation, yet nothing returned to normal. Diplomatic language hardened incrementally. Each statement built upon the last, narrowing options while maintaining the illusion of flexibility. The public grew restless. Protests emerged, not unified, but scattered. Some demanded stronger action. Others demanded disengagement. Governments cited public opinion selectively, using whichever sentiment supported their existing trajectory. Media retrospectives revisited the seer's predictions with renewed interest. Commentators debated whether his accuracy was coincidence or insight. Skeptics argued he was vague. Supporters pointed to the sequence, not the specifics. That distinction mattered, because the seer never claimed to predict events. He predicted behavior. He said leaders would frame ambition as necessity, that allies would hesitate until hesitation became position, that rivals would misread restraint as weakness and weakness as opportunity. Most chillingly, he said the moment of no return would not feel like a decision. It would feel like continuation. By the time international organizations attempted renewed mediation, the ground had shifted. Trust was depleted. Assurances were dismissed as performative. Each side questioned not just the intentions, but the capacity of others to control outcomes. The system had entered what strategists call path dependency. Early choices constrained later ones even when circumstances changed. In other words, the future had weight, and it was pulling everything forward. As months unfolded, the world adjusted to this new baseline. Crisis fatigue set in. What once would have dominated headlines became background noise. That normalization was itself a form of surrender. The seer had warned about that too. He said people would adapt faster than they realized, accepting conditions they would have rejected only months earlier. That acceptance would be interpreted by leaders as consent. And consent, once assumed, rarely needs renewal. In the final part, we will examine the long shadow of that quiet day, how its consequences continued to unfold, why reversal became nearly impossible, and what the seer believed was the only force capable of interrupting the trajectory once it was set. Long after the headlines shifted and attention drifted elsewhere, the consequences of that quiet turning point continued to unfold. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like a tide that reshapes a shoreline while everyone is looking inland. The seer had described this phase as the most dangerous, precisely because it felt stable. No explosions, no declarations of war, just a new arrangement of pressure, normalized and reinforced through repetition. What had once been framed as temporary measures quietly became permanent features of the global landscape. Trade routes adjusted first, then investment patterns. Certain regions became financial dead zones, not because of sanctions alone, but because uncertainty made long-term planning impossible. Capital does not flee in panic anymore. It withdraws politely, one decision at a time. Political language followed. Leaders stopped promising resolution and started promising management. Conflicts were no longer described as problems to be solved, but realities to be navigated. That shift signaled resignation disguised as pragmatism. The seer had warned that when leaders stop speaking about endings, it means they no longer believe in them. Within the southern state, internal fractures widened. Economic strain amplified old grievances. Loyalty became transactional. Support depended less on ideology and more on access to diminishing resources. Power consolidated upward, justified by the need for unity under pressure. Public messaging emphasized resilience. Survival became the metric of success. Comparison to the past was discouraged, labeled unproductive or destabilizing. The future, once imagined as progress, was reframed as endurance. In the Northern power, the consequences were subtler, but no less significant. Strategic gains came with long-term costs. Alliances became more conditional. Trust eroded even among partners. Every agreement now included contingencies, escape clauses, and unspoken assumptions of eventual divergence. The neighboring nation found itself permanently altered. What had begun as precaution hardened into posture. Infrastructure designed for temporary stress became structural. Generations grew up knowing no alternative state of affairs. The seer had said this country would pay the highest price for decisions it did not initiate, not because it lacked agency, but because it existed between narratives larger than itself. International institutions struggled to respond. Their frameworks were built for crises with identifiable beginnings and ends. This situation had neither. It was continuous, adaptive, and resistant to resolution. Reports were written, panels convened, recommendations issued. Nothing fundamentally changed. As years passed, the predictions were revisited less frequently, not because they were discredited, but because they were no longer necessary. Reality had absorbed them. What once sounded prophetic now sounded obvious. That, the seer believed, was the final stage, when foresight becomes hindsight. In one of his last recorded statements on the subject, he said the greatest misconception about prediction is the belief that knowing the future allows one to avoid it. In truth, he argued, knowledge often accelerates outcomes by creating the illusion of preparedness. People assume awareness equals control. It rarely does. He maintained that the only force capable of altering such trajectories was not power, nor policy, nor even collective action in its conventional sense. It was attention. Sustained, uncomfortable attention that refuses normalization. When societies stop treating prolonged tension as background noise, leaders are forced to respond differently. When the public demands not management but meaning, systems either adapt or fracture, but attention is difficult to maintain. It requires resisting fatigue. It requires refusing simple narratives. And it requires acknowledging complicity in outcomes shaped by silence as much as speech. The world that emerged from that quiet turning point did not collapse. It recalibrated. Borders held. Governments remained. Life continued. That continuity was the illusion. Beneath it, assumptions had shifted. Risk was redefined. Stability was downgraded. The future was no longer a destination, but a moving constraint. The seer did not claim vindication. He never framed his words as warnings meant to inspire fear. He described them as observations drawn from patterns older than any individual leader or nation. Power seeks momentum. Uncertainty creates opportunity. And history rarely announces its pivots. It whispers them. By the time most people realize something irreversible has happened, the moment to prevent it has already passed. What remains then is responsibility, not for what was done, but for what is allowed to continue. And that, according to the seer, is where prediction ends and choice begins.